Welcome back. This is episode number 13 of this tutorial series on Raspberry Pi for complete beginners. You can find the series playlist in the description. And let's get started. So you can use the Raspberry Pi to control hardware components, yes, but there is so much more you can do. For example, you can create and host a web server on the Raspberry Pi. That's what we are going to focus on this tutorial and the following ones. I will show you how to create a web server using the Flask framework with Python. This skill set will be super useful for your next projects. And let's jump directly to the code. So to use Flask, you are going to do from Flask import Flask. Okay, Flask uppercase here and Flask lowercase here. This way you can import the Flask framework. And you can notice that if you run the code, it will work because Flask is already installed as a Python module on your Raspberry Pi operating system here. So one of the first things you will need to do in your application is to initialize Flask. So you are going to create an app variable, for example, and Flask, write Flask with parentheses, and inside that underscore name underscore. Okay, this is a special thing in Python, and this will initialize Flask. Okay, so there is really nothing to understand here. It's just you have to write that to initialize the application. And then to actually run the server, so we are going here to create some routes that correspond to different URLs. Okay, this will be the main functionalities of the application. And then at the end we are going to do app.run to run the application actually, and we need to give host equal 0.0.0.040. And this line here will run the application. It will kind of block the program here and run the application until you stop the program with Ctrl+C, for example. So this is basically the main structure you will have in all your programs with Flask. As I told you, there is nothing really to understand, just this is the syntax to write. And here you can see we have host 0000. This is so every computer in the network will be able to actually connect to that server. So now I'm going to create a route, and to do that I'm going to do @app, so app, this is the app from there, .root, and I'm going to give the root inside the parentheses here, and I will simply use slash. So slash will be the home page. Okay, when you go to a website, let's say website.com, the slash is basically when you just go to website.com and you don't add any other text in the URL. Okay, if you go to website.com/example, then you will need to create a route with /example. Okay, and so this will create a route, and you need to associate a function to it. So we are going to call that function index. Usually the index goes to the main root URL here. So when you go to the server with that URL, the index function will be called, and it is expected to return a string with text or HTML or whatever, and this will be then interpreted by your web browser and printed so the user can actually see the result. So we are going to return here simply a string, hello from Flask. So this should appear on the web browser. Okay, I'm going to run that. Let's save as web server. Note that it's important, you can't name the file flask.py, okay, otherwise you will have an error. As a best practice, try not to name your file with the same name as a module that you use in that file. So here you can see the server is running, okay, running on HTTP, and then you have the URL, and the port is 5000. So I click on that, and as you can see, a new web browser has been opened, and we see hello from Flask. Great. And as you can see, when we actually call the URL, you have a new log. If I do enter here, okay, we have something new, get slash, so this is the main root, and this we call the index function, okay, and then you can see 200 means that it was correctly done and the result could be delivered. So here you can see the URL is 0.0.0.0 and then colon 5000. So this is the IP address basically, and this is the port. So if you don't put 5000, then of course you will have an error because you need to provide both the IP address and the port. Now I can also use 127.0.0.1. Okay, this works. When you host an application on the computer, this IP address is kind of reserved, and it means that you are just reaching to the computer you are currently in. Okay, so 127.0.0.1, and you can also use local host. Okay, this will do the same, local host. Now here, as you can see, I am using a web browser inside the Raspberry Pi. But maybe you want to use a web browser outside of the Raspberry Pi with a computer that is connected on the same network, so you can get access to the web server from the Raspberry Pi on a different computer. And in that case, it's very easy. I'm going to open a terminal and I'm going to do hostname -I to get the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. So you should already know that, okay, because you are connected to it. So this is the IP address of the Raspberry Pi in the network. So if I just write the IP address here, 192.168.43.56. And as you can see, I also have the results. So from another computer, let's say this is a web browser from another computer, I can access the web server in the Raspberry Pi using directly the IP address on the network, and then of course followed by the port. And if you want to change the port, okay, instead of 5000, you may want to use a different one. In that case, so let's stop the application. You can add here an argument port, and let's say 8500. If you want to use a different port than 5000, so you can choose any port you want, just take a port that is at least 1024, okay, because the ports before 1024 are already reserved. So now I'm running here the script, and if I go back to my application, so of course now there is nothing on port 5000. If I go to port 8500, I can find the application. Alright, that's the end of this episode. If you found it useful, you will definitely like my full complete course on Raspberry Pi named Raspberry Pi for Beginners. This course contains 10 hours of hands-on video lessons. You can find the link in the description. Thank you for watching, see you in the course or in the next tutorial of the series.